At first, the Japanese did not think the thing coming at them was the real danger. That was how the killing began. Out on the water, men learned to fear size, big silhouettes, heavy guns, fast destroyers cutting spray off their bows, bombers coming in high enough to make the whole sea feel exposed. That was what commanders watched for. That was what gunners prepared their nerves around. The idea that something small, low, and strange-looking could become the most violent thing on the horizon in a matter of seconds felt wrong even before it felt deadly. That was why they were not ready for the devil boat. Some later remembered it as an airplane. Others remembered it as something worse, a shape skimming so low and so hard over the water that it no longer looked like a normal aircraft at all, but a hunting thing half hidden by spray, glare, and speed. In the confusion of attack, men do not always describe what they saw accurately. They describe what it felt like, and what this felt like was not a clean air raid beginning from altitude. It felt like a weapon rising straight out of the sea. That was the first advantage. Not firepower, misreading. The P-39 was not supposed to inspire naval terror by appearance alone. It was a fighter, built for air combat, compact and aggressive, but not the sort of machine a sailor would mistake for a fleet killer at first glance. Yet in the right conditions, low over water, nose thrust forward, closing at attack speed, arriving from the kind of angle that gives defenders almost no time to sort shape from threat, it could become something psychologically larger than itself. And on that day, that was exactly what happened. The Japanese force on the water had reason to feel secure at first. Ships, escorts, men, at stations, guns, ready in the ordinary sense. They were not asleep. They were not defenseless. But readiness in war is often built around the wrong expectation. Crews prepare for the attack they think is coming, and in that tiny gap between expectation and reality, entire formations die badly. The real danger here was not just that the P-39 could attack, it was how it attacked. Low, fast, direct. That combination turns seconds into catastrophe. A high attack gives ships time to track, identify, elevate guns, warn nearby vessels, and build a common picture of what is happening. A low attack tears that picture apart. It arrives beneath comfort, beneath the natural line of watching eyes, beneath the level where calm reporting becomes easy. Men do not have time to study it. They only have time to react, and reaction is usually worse than preparation. The devil boat came in through that weakness. First as a shape, then as motion, then as violence. By the time the Japanese crews understood, they were not looking at some distant nuisance, but a direct attack platform driving at the formation. The fight had already entered the phase that decides most low-level strikes, the first pass. That first pass matters because it does not only deliver damage, it decides whether the defenders will spend the next minute acting like an organized force or a frightened collection of separate ships. That was the target before any single vessel was. Order. The P-39 was not hunting one heroic kill. It was hunting collapse. That is the part many people misunderstand about devastating attack runs. They imagine destruction as a pile of explosions, but the best strike pilots know the real work starts earlier. Hit the lead vessel, and spacing changes. Force one escort to turn, and another ship loses clear water. Set one deck ablaze, and smoke begins stealing sight lines from every gun crew behind it. Damage is physical. Collapse is contagious. The devil boat was built for contagion. The pilot came in so low that the aircraft seemed stitched to the water. Spray and reflected light worked with the speed of the approach, blurring recognition just enough to make proper response late. A gunner who sees clearly can fight. A gunner who is still trying to understand what he is looking at is already behind the attack. That delay was fatal. Then the guns opened. The first burst hit like a starter's pistol for panic. Not because one ship immediately died in some dramatic fireball, but because impact arrived before the formation had emotionally accepted attack. Tracers ripped across deck space and hull line. Men ducked before command could settle. A gun position that should have answered cleanly was suddenly fighting for survival. Another crew, seeing rounds strike nearby, began reacting to the violence rather than the plan. This is how order starts dying at sea, not all at once, but in quick, ugly pieces. The P-39 did not linger. that mattered. A weak pilot attacks once, then drifts inside his own success, giving defenders time to center him. A dangerous pilot strikes and moves before the enemy has converted fear into geometry. The Devil boat slashed through the first target area, left damage behind, and forced every Japanese ship to ask a different question at the same time. Where is it now? That question is poison in a naval formation under low-level air attack. One ship thinks the aircraft has passed and begins correcting guns too late. Another thinks it is coming again from the same side and stares into empty water. A third ship, trying to help, fires through angles already complicated by friendly spacing and smoke. The attacker has not just wounded steel, he has broken the shared picture that lets ships defend each other intelligently. That was the second stage of the killing, confusion. The Japanese had numbers, guns, and hulls in the water, but numbers only matter while they still behave like one body. Now they were becoming separate captains, separate gunners, separate fears, and the P-39 was about to punish that separation. Because once low-level attack turns a formation inward on itself, each new pass lands harder than the last. Each new pass lands harder than the last. Men who were steady a minute ago start firing too early. Others hold too long, waiting for a cleaner sight that never comes. Some crews fixate on the aircraft. Others focus on the damage already spreading across nearby decks. In those divided seconds, the attacker owns the pace. That was why the tiny shape became legendary. Not because it looked powerful, because it looked too small to do this much harm. A machine the Japanese should have dismissed was now deciding the rhythm of the water around them. And every second it stayed alive, every pass it completed, every burst it placed into a ship that had not fully recovered from the last shock. The legend grew darker. It was no longer just an aircraft skimming in low. It was becoming a presence, a devil on the waterline, and as the P-39 hauled through the smoke and spray for another attack, the Japanese finally understood the real problem. This was not a brief nuisance. It was the beginning of a massacre, and that realization made the water even more dangerous. The first pass had shattered calm. One ship hit, deck crews ducking, guns disrupted, smoke and sparks breaking the clean surface of control. But the second phase of a low-level attack is always worse than the first, because by then the defenders know they are under real threat and still have no clear way to stop it. That is where fear begins spoiling discipline, and spoiled discipline kills fleets faster than bullets. Across the Japanese formation, reactions were already splitting apart. One gun crew tracked too high, still expecting an aircraft to climb after the first run. Another kept searching the wrong side of the formation, convinced the P-39 would repeat the same angle. A third vessel, seeing confusion spread around it, began firing early just to avoid being the next ship caught unready. That burst solved nothing. It only added noise, flashes, and more uncertainty to water that was already losing its order. That was exactly what the Devil boat needed. Because low-level attack is not just about hitting a target. It is about seizing the next second before the target has finished understanding the last one. The P-39 came back in through smoke, glare, and spray at the kind of height that made every gunner's life harder. Too low for comfort, too fast for neat correction, too sudden for men whose nerves were now divided between the aircraft itself and the damage already spreading through the formation. By the time the Japanese saw it clearly again, the attack had already entered the fatal zone. Then the guns opened. This time the burst walked across a different vessel, and that mattered more than raw damage. A second ship under direct fire meant the attack was no longer an isolated strike. It was a pattern. The Japanese now had to accept that the P-39 was not just passing through their line. It was working it apart deliberately, using speed and low approach to spread pressure from one hull to the next before the formation could settle. That was how the destruction began multiplying. The rounds tore across exposed positions, along deck space, into the places where men needed steadiness most. A ship under attack at sea does not only suffer from physical damage, it suffers from interruption. Orders break, guns pause, men flatten themselves against steel instead of serving the weapon beside them. A vessel that should be contributing to the formation's defense becomes temporarily consumed by its own survival. Now there were at least two such ships, and every ship nearby felt it. The P-39 flashed through before the Japanese could build a clean response. That mattered as much as the burst itself. A slow or greedy attacker gives ships time to center their anger. A fast attacker leaves behind a more corrosive emotion: helplessness. The men on the water had seen the devil boat again, had fired, had shouted, had tried to bring their guns and spacing together, and still the aircraft had sliced through them before their reaction became useful. That is when formations begin turning against themselves. A captain trying to maneuver away from attack steals clear lines from the ship beside him. A gunner desperate for a shot risks firing through smoke and confusion into spaces that are no longer clean. A crew watching another deck burn begins reacting to spectacle instead of instruction. All of those things were happening now. The Japanese still had hulls, crews, and weapons in the water, but they were no longer acting like one body. That was the collapse the P-39 had been building from the first second. The devil boat was not just a nickname anymore. It was becoming the only rhythm that mattered. Every eye searched for it. Every order was shaped around it. Every captain was now thinking less about formation purpose and more about surviving the next appearance of that low, violent shape racing just above the waterline. The aircraft had taken control of the battle's tempo, and once a single attacker owns the tempo, the larger force starts bleeding its advantages without always noticing it. The next pass proved that, instead of coming back exactly as before, the P-39 shifted angle just enough to keep prediction from becoming comfort. That change was deadly. Men under repeated attack do not need complete understanding to fight back. They only need a pattern. Give them one, and even frightened crews can begin building timing around it. But alter the line of approach, and fear arrives fresh. What little confidence had started forming on the Japanese ships was cut away before it could harden. Again the aircraft came in low. Again the water seemed too small to hide it until the last seconds. Again the Japanese were late. The burst hit amidships on another vessel, then dragged across positions that should have been answering with force. Fire flared. Men broke from stations. One escort, seeing the strike land, began turning with more urgency than precision, its movement now creating problems for other nearby ships that were already trying to sort smoke, blast, and gun angles into something usable. Instead of repairing the formation, the maneuver widened its disorder. That was the hidden genius of the attack. The P-39 did not need to sink every ship in sight with one miraculous pass. It only needed to keep each vessel from helping the next. That is how a small attacker produces damage that feels impossible from the water. Not by outgunning a fleet head-on, but by forcing each ship into its own emergency, while the larger formation falls apart around them. The Japanese had enough force to be dangerous together. The devil boat was making sure they stayed separate. And once separation takes hold in battle, panic starts breeding. Some crews fired too early. Others waited too long. Some captains tried to turn into the attack. Others tried to open distance. One ship's smoke became another ship's blindness. One ship's panic maneuver became another ship's lost line of fire. The sea itself, which should have given the Japanese room, now seemed to narrow under the pressure of speed, noise, and burning confusion. The P-39 kept feeding on that narrowing space. It did not have the size of a bomber or the prestige of a major strike package. That was part of what made the scene so humiliating. The destruction was being driven by something that looked too small to deserve this much fear. Men on the water expect terror to come from grand shapes. Waves of aircraft, massive hulls, overwhelming bombardment. Instead, terror had arrived as one hard-nosed machine skimming low like a predator that had found the exact height at which organized defense begins to fail. Now the Japanese were no longer waiting to see whether the attack was serious. They were waiting to see where it would hit next. That is a disastrous mental shift in combat. The moment defenders stop thinking in terms of stopping the attacker and start thinking in terms of enduring him, the initiative is gone. The devil boat had taken it completely. Every new pass deepened the belief that the aircraft was somehow already inside the formation's reactions, already ahead of their corrections, already choosing which part of the water would panic next. That was why the nickname stuck. Not because the P-39 looked supernatural, because it made normal naval defense feel useless. And as the smoke thickened, the sea cluttered with damage, and another Japanese vessel struggled to recover from the latest strike. The men on the water were beginning to face a harder truth than simple attack. This was no longer a formation under assault. It was a formation being dismantled. That was worse than simple destruction. A ship under attack can still survive if the force around it remains stable. Nearby guns can cover it. Escorts can adjust. Captains can restore spacing. Smoke can be worked around if enough men still trust the larger picture. But once the larger picture dies, every vessel starts carrying its own private panic, and private panic is how whole groups go down one by one, while still technically remaining in the same patch of water. That was where the Japanese now found themselves. The first pass had broken calm, the second had broken coordination. Now the third phase was breaking belief. Across the water, men were no longer reacting as part of a confident force. They were reacting as crews who had begun to suspect that the next appearance of the Devil Boat would arrive before they could properly answer the last one. That suspicion poisoned everything. Gunners gripped too hard and fired too soon. Officers shouted corrections into noise already too thick for clean command. Captains tried to preserve order while smoke, flame, and sudden turns kept stealing the very spacing that order depended on. And through all of it, the P-39 kept coming. That was the terrifying part. Not just that it had struck hard, that it refused to feel finished. A lesser attacker would have made one savage pass, perhaps two, then faded from the center of the fight as the defenders finally found their range and rhythm. The Devil Boat did the opposite. It kept returning at the exact moment when the Japanese most needed one clear minute to rebuild themselves. Every time the formation tried to steady, the aircraft came back low, fast, and at an angle that forced the water into fresh confusion. That was how the damage became legend, not in one impossible explosion, in repeated interruptions that prevented the Japanese from turning surviving ships back into a functioning body. The next run drove that truth home. The P-39 came through smoke and spray so low that it seemed less like something flying above the sea than something cutting through it. Men saw the nose, the shape, the speed, and by the time recognition became useful, the guns were already speaking. The burst tore into another vessel, striking where crews needed their nerve most. Fire flashed. Deck positions collapsed into movement. One ship tried to maneuver clear, another, trying to support it, lost its own clean lane. Somewhere farther down the line, gunners fired into angles made useless by smoke and shifting hulls. Again the Japanese answered the attack. Again their answer was late. That delay had become the real killer. The Devil Boat was not simply faster than their reactions. It was living inside the gap between seeing and understanding. Every pass widened that gap until the defenders were no longer fighting the aircraft itself so much as fighting the failure of their own timing. And once timing dies, a formation starts feeling cursed even when the cause is completely real. That was why survivors remembered it the way they did, not as just another American fighter, but as a small, vicious presence that seemed to rise from the waterline and choose where panic would break next. By now, the Japanese force still possessed ships, guns, and men, but it no longer possessed coherence. That was decisive. A fleet or convoy does not need every hull to be sunk before it stops functioning. It only needs enough smoke, enough fire, enough interrupted command, enough broken spacing, and enough fear that the surviving vessels can no longer defend or support each other properly. The P-39 had spent the whole attack aiming for exactly that result. It had not been trying to win a duel with one ship. It had been turning a body of vessels into separate emergencies. Once that happened, the count of damage could rise with terrifying speed. One stricken ship blocked another's response. One panicked maneuver opened a new weakness. One burning deck stole sight from the guns behind it. One low pass forced every captain to think first of his own survival. That is how a tiny attacker begins producing destruction that sounds exaggerated when told too simply, because the true weapon is no longer just machine guns or accuracy. It is cascading failure. The Devil Boat had triggered it, fed it, and kept it alive long enough for the Japanese force to feel much larger in suffering than it looked on the map. And that was the final humiliation. The thing doing all this did not look like the kind of terror sailors were trained to imagine. It was not a massive strike package darkening the sky, not a battleship hammering from distance, not some vast show of mechanical power. It was one hard, low, compact attacker forcing a much larger force to experience battle as a sequence of personal disasters. That is why the nickname endured, because P-39 described the machine. Devil Boat described the feeling. By the end, the sea behind the attack was no longer just disturbed water and scattered damage. It was wreckage, burning confusion, broken rhythm, and the memory of men realizing too late that they had underestimated the smallest shape in the battle. What should have been an easy target to dismiss had become the thing controlling the whole fight. And once the Japanese recognized that truth, the worst of the damage had already been done. That was the lesson. The Devil Boat did not need size to dominate the water. It needed surprise, low attack, geometry, and the discipline to keep breaking order before order could recover. Everything else followed from that. P-39 became the Devil Boat because it attacked low, fast, and repeatedly enough to stop the Japanese ships from acting like one force. It did not just damage vessels. It destroyed timing, spacing, and confidence until the entire formations began collapsing into separate emergencies. That was the difference. What looked too small to matter became unforgettable because it turned the sea itself into panic. And by the time the Japanese understood the scale of the threat, the massacre was already underway.